People who have experienced paranormal activity, what is your story? I grew up in a house that had once been an old folks' home. At night, the entire place seemed alive with creaks and pops, as if invisible footsteps were pacing up and down the stairs. My mom was convinced the house was haunted, while my dad insisted it was just the house settling. After all, in 1984, it was already a century old. One night, I woke to the sharp sound of a door slamming. Heart racing, I crept down the hall and cautiously peeked around the corner at the staircase. At the bottom, where a closet stood, its door was slightly ajar, just 6 or 8 inches, but inside, a human face stared back at me. I bolted to the bathroom, trying to steady my trembling. When I finally forced myself to peek down the stairs again, the face was gone. That house held countless moments like that, strange experiences that defy easy explanation. When I was about 5, I went to bed like any other night, but I woke to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, until I heard, "Hey, psst." I looked up and froze. Standing on 2 legs at the foot of my bed was a black dog with glowing yellow eyes. I screamed and cried, calling for my parents. When they rushed into the room, the creature darted behind a chair, disappearing from view. I was so terrified that I ended up sleeping with my parents for an entire week, and I never saw that thing again. But it haunted me in dreams. In each one, it had this terrifying power to freeze me in place, right in front of my parents, who never seemed to notice or intervene. Years later, I learned that in Turkey, people report similar experiences. They call the being a jinn, a creature that can enter a person's room, pin them down, and suffocate them. Thankfully, that never happened to me, but the memory of those dreams still sends a shiver down my spine. I was about 16, home alone at my stepdad's house one night. Everyone else had gone out. The house is in a small, rural village where everyone knows each other, and most of the family lives nearby. One quirky thing about the house, nobody ever used the front door. Visitors always came through the garden, using the back door to walk right in. It was around 10 p.m., and I was watching TV when the doorbell rang. My heart jumped. Who could be at the door at this hour? I looked out the window to see the front doorstep, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the bell rang again. No one had pressed it. My whole body felt aflame with adrenaline and fear, and I froze in place as it rang again and again. I grabbed my phone to call my mom, shaking with terror, but there was no answer. Then, as suddenly as it started, the ringing stopped. About an hour later, my parents returned. I immediately told them what had happened, half panicked, half angry that they hadn't answered my calls. My stepdad chuckled. "Oh yeah," he said. "That's my wife. It happens sometimes." His previous wife, his partner for years, had passed away a few years earlier. He explained that he had tried to fix the doorbell, but there was nothing wrong with it. Their theory? When the doorbell rings on its own, it's her, letting them know she's still around. I lived in a haunted house for a year. At the time, it was just me and my 3 sisters, ages 13, 5, and 2. I was 10. One day, my older sister and I were home from school with a stomach bug. Our mom had to pick up our 5-year-old from school and asked us to watch the baby. We were sitting in the living room, and the baby had a sippy cup of water. The lid wasn't on tight, and when she knocked it over, water spilled everywhere. My older sister ran to the kitchen for napkins. When she returned, she handed me some, and we got down on our hands and knees to clean. Then we heard it, a bang from the second floor. We froze and looked at each other, eyes wide, silently asking, "Did you hear that too?" We stayed quiet, pretending to keep cleaning. Another bang echoed. This time, we stood up, staring at the ceiling. Then came the giggles. Little children laughing upstairs. The laughter shifted into singing, like a choir of children, just above us. My sister scooped up the baby, and we ran outside. It was a clear day, but as soon as we stepped out, rain began to pour. With no choice, we went back inside and stayed on the front porch until our mom came home. We saw things in that house that still haunt me, even 20 years later. But somehow, it was that giggling and singing, the sound of invisible children, that stayed with me the most. I used to work as a contractor, inspecting all kinds of buildings. One of the places I had to check was an old psychiatric hospital, long abandoned and known locally as Redacted Asylum. I was working on one of the upper floors when the atmosphere started to feel off. It was August, but suddenly it felt freezing inside. My instincts screamed at me to leave, so I decided to calmly, but quickly, head for the exit. As I was descending the stairs, somewhere between the second and third floor, something grabbed my ankle. My fight or flight response kicked in instantly. I bolted, not caring if anyone saw me in sheer panic. I ran straight out, ripped off my PP, called my contact to let them know I was out, and left for the day, citing outstanding reports. When I got home, I tried to convince myself it hadn't happened. But deep down, I knew it had. I've always slept with my bedroom door open. My room is small, and it feels even smaller when the door is closed, and I was a kid who was terrified of the dark. One night, I woke up for no reason. Across from my bed was a mirror that faced the hallway, so from where I was lying, I could see everything outside my room. That night, I saw something in the mirror that still haunts me. It looked like my mom, standing there, looking down at me, and smiling. But it wasn't just a normal smile. It was the kind of smile that made your skin crawl, unnerving in a way I couldn't explain. I blinked, and she was gone. I don't know if it was a sleep-deprived hallucination or something else entirely, but whatever I saw that night, it definitely wasn't my mom. This isn't as intense as some of the other stories I've read, but my apartment seems to have its own shadow resident. I often see it moving in my office. Sometimes from the hallway, I'll catch a shadow that looks like a medium-built man pacing around, and other times, while sitting at my desk, I'll notice movement out of the corner of my eye, like someone is standing at my shoulder. I'll turn, expecting to see my boyfriend, but no one's there. I've also spotted it near the bottom of the stairs, by the front door. Even the closet right next to that spot has opened itself a few times while I've been home alone, cooking in the kitchen. It's never scared me, though. Whether it's a trick of the lighting or a bona fide shadow figure, I don't worry about it much. That changed slightly when I had a bad bout of COVID. One night, running a 103 degrees Fahrenheit fever, I was miserable, falling in and out of sleep, anxious about my rising temperature and labored breathing. I kept thinking of my aunt, who had died in her sleep early in the pandemic from COVID. The fear of that happening to me was very real. At some point, I fell asleep, but I was woken by a shadow figure entering my room and standing over me. I couldn't see details, only a dark outline. It seemed to be speaking, but the words were unintelligible, like it was asking me something. Eventually, it turned and left. I might have chalked it up to a fever hallucination, if my cat hadn't jumped from her bed to stare at the figure. Who knows, maybe I even imagined her reaction. Still, I like to think my shadow roommate came to check on me when I was at my sickest, anxious, and alone, since my boyfriend couldn't be there. I used to babysit my niece and nephew when they were 4 and 5 while my sister went to work. She lived just down the street. so I'd walk over in the morning before the kids woke up. One morning, after my sister left, I lay down on the couch to rest. Suddenly, I heard one of the kids running down the hall. I immediately pretended to be asleep, hoping they'd go back to bed. I felt my niece dash past me on the couch. The thumping of her feet shook the floor, the trinkets on the shelves rattled, and I even felt the rush of air as she blew by. Then it went quiet, but I knew she was still there. Suddenly, she leaned over my ear, brushed my hair aside, and laughed softly. I couldn't help but marvel at her audacity. Then she ducked under the end table at the couch. Realizing she wasn't going back to bed until I woke up, I got up and looked. There was no one there. Completely baffled at how she had vanished in literally 2 seconds without a sound, I went down the hall to check her room. My nephew was sound asleep in his bedroom. When I opened my niece's door, she was tucked in under the covers, fast asleep. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. My aunt and grandma were supposed to come over and bring dinner. I clearly heard the back door open and my aunt's voice calling out, "Come help us grab a few things from the car." I jumped off the couch and rushed to help, but when I got to the door, no one was there. The driveway was completely empty. Confused, I called my aunt's phone. The moment she picked up, she said, Yeah, we're running a bit late, just leaving Grandma's house now." I froze. Whoever I heard in the back of the house hadn't been them. My mom was staying at a B&B in Newfoundland. After turning off the lights to go to sleep, she suddenly felt a presence in the room and heard a soft, gentle whisper in her ear, "Hello." The next morning at breakfast, she told the B&B host what had happened. The host nodded casually and said, "Oh, that's just Sally," explaining that other guests had seen her ghost too. Years ago, when I was just a kid, my mom and I lived in an old apartment in Massachusetts. One afternoon, I was watching TV while she was cooking when she suddenly screamed, calling me over, "Look at this." I ran into the dining room to see her standing by the table, which was empty except for a single blue plastic cup at one end. Confused, I asked her what was going on. She didn't answer. She simply picked up the cup and set it down at the other end of the table. The moment she released it, the cup slid across the table on its own, stopping perfectly at the edge. I jumped back, stunned. My mom picked up the cup and did it again. And again. 3 times in a row, the same thing happened. Growing up, I loved science and technology. I later became an engineer, so I tried to find a rational explanation. I examined the cup closely, looked under and around the table. The table was spotless. No wires, magnets, or tricks. I tried other objects, and nothing moved. It only happened with this blue plastic cup. Eventually, I watched it from just 2 inches away. The cup actually vibrated as it moved, a subtle motion you could only notice up close. To this day, I still don't know what caused it. And that wasn't the only strange thing that happened in that apartment. I was doing plumbing in the basement of a 120-year-old house on a lake in northern Michigan. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced to my left and saw a man in overalls walk straight through the wall. Just like that, he vanished. I didn't stick around to investigate. I left that house and never went back. When I was in my early 20s, I spent the night at a friend's house. Around midnight, they pulled out a Ouija board. Almost immediately, The board started spelling out terrifying messages aimed at me, telling me I needed to leave immediately and that it hated me. I didn't believe in the supernatural, but I also knew my friends wouldn't be that cruel. For about 30 minutes, the board continued sending increasingly hostile messages. The final one claimed that if I had left earlier, I would have died in a car accident. Completely unnerved, I ended up sleeping between my friends in one bed for the rest of the night. The next day, my mom told me about my cat's bizarre behavior between midnight and 1 a.m. My Siamese, Toulouse, had been running frantically down the upstairs hallway, flinging herself full force against my closed bedroom door, meowing desperately and loudly. My parents were genuinely worried she might hurt herself. I truly believe she was trying to reach me, trying to protect me from something. She never behaved like that before or since. My dad has experienced a few moments where he hears my mom calling him, even when there's no phone or anything around. One example, she dropped him off for a half-day conference in a large downtown office tower and planned to do some shopping while waiting to pick him up. About 30 minutes later, she started feeling very sick. She rushed back to the building but didn't know where he was or how to contact him. Desperate, she repeated his name over and over in her mind. "Steve, I need you. Steve, I need you." 10 minutes later, he came running out to her car, out of breath, asking, "What? What do you want?" He drove her to the hospital, and it turned out she needed an emergency appendectomy. Another time, my dad was driving down a busy road where the main lanes have the right of way, and cars from side streets must stop and merge when there's a break. As he drove along, he suddenly heard a clear voice shouting, "Steve." He looked around. No one was in the car with him. Windows were closed. He was going about 50 miles per hour. Then he heard it again, "Steve." He slowed down and checked the rearview mirror, thinking maybe it was a friend trying to get his attention. Moments later, a dump truck blew through the stop sign at the intersection he would have crossed. If he hadn't slowed down, he would have been flattened. When my grandson was about 3 or 4, he asked me something that gave me chills. He pointed at the couch and said, "Who's that old lady sitting there?" I looked, but the couch was completely empty. Some kids just see things we can't. I often joke about this, but it's true. I can never see my own reflection in a mirror. Whenever I go to look, there's always an old man standing in front of me, blocking my view. When we were young teenagers, a bunch of us were hanging out at a neighborhood friend's house, and he thought it would be fun to pull out a Ouija board. We were all stupid kids, ridiculously high at the time, and had no idea what we were doing. We sat around the board in the living room, asking silly questions about ghosts, spirits, dead relatives, and the like. Then something happened that none of us will ever forget. The guy's dog, a huge, old, morbidly overweight mutt who was usually the definition of lazy, suddenly jumped up, bolted into the dining room, and started barking and snarling furiously at the light fixture above the table. There was nothing there. No one, no movement, nothing. Just a light hanging from the ceiling. Then the dog let out a piercing yelp, like he had been kicked, spun around, and ran out of the room, yelping the whole way. We just sat there, mouths hanging open, trying to process what we'd just seen. When reality started to creep back in, we threw the Ouija board across the room and bolted out of that house like it was on fire. It honestly felt like a scene straight out of a horror movie, but it really happened. Later, we all agreed. There was no way we'd hallucinated this, no matter how much bud we had smoked earlier. This might sound silly, but I still believe it nearly 2 decades later. In the narrow space between my bed and nightstand, I saw a blinking eye, just floating there, staring off into nothing. It never looked at me. Every time I bolted out of the room to get my parents, it would vanish. I didn't set foot in that bedroom for 8 months. Another time, my mom was walking down the hall when the bathroom door suddenly swung open on its own, hitting her. I could hear her yelling, "What the hell?" Then the smoke alarm started going crazy. On a whim, we started asking it questions, using beep once for yes, twice for no. It cooperated for a short while, then abruptly stopped, leaving us unsettled and silent. A buddy of mine lived in a really old building, built sometime in the early 1800s, in a small, historic town in Texas. His apartment was upstairs, with businesses on the ground floor. The whole structure had originally been a small factory, later remodeled for modern use. There were some obvious signs it wasn't built to be a home. A tiny door in his closet that led to a narrow, empty space between the walls, serving no apparent purpose. Sometimes the door would swing open on its own, letting in freezing cold air. He chalked it up to the quirks of old buildings, remodeling, strange ventilation, and things not quite lining up. Odd noises would sometimes come from that closet, but he wrote them off the same way. Windows in the apartment also had a habit of being open when he hadn't touched them. He'd close them, only to find them open again later. Again, he assumed it was just faulty latches and nothing more. One day, he stayed home from work and heard a window unlatch. Then another. Then another, one after the other, as if someone were walking through the living room, unlatching each window in order. Then, all at once, all the windows slammed open. Terrified, he left the apartment for the day. He came back that weekend, nothing happened, and he told himself it was just an old building acting up. But a month later, his girlfriend experienced the same thing when she was home alone. Eventually, they just got used to it. Weird windows, they told themselves. Then they got a puppy. Normally happy and playful, the dog would freeze completely whenever the closet door blew open or the windows unlatched. Its eyes would lock onto something no one else could see, slowly tracking across the room as if following some invisible presence. No one ever figured out what the dog was watching, but it only happened when other strange things were occurring. After a few of these incidents, they moved out. I used to work in the Winchester Mystery House. For those who don't know, it's the sprawling mansion built by the heiress to the Winchester rifle fortune. She designed the house with confusing rooms, doors, and stairways that led nowhere, supposedly to confuse the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles. Over the years, employees reported ghost sightings, and the house was officially listed as haunted. I worked in one of the 160 rooms, handling phones and office tasks. Part of my job was to notify the tour station when the last tour exited, since my office was near the end of the route and I could hear the footsteps of the groups. One evening around 6 p.m., as I was closing up, I heard footsteps in the house. I called the tour station to report that the last tour was exiting, but they told me the final tour had left an hour earlier. My first thought was that it must be my manager doing a patrol. When he came back to the office, I asked if he'd been in the house. He said no, he'd been in the gift shop. He'd locked up and assured me there was no one in the house. As he spoke, we continued hearing footsteps above us. We exchanged the look you give someone when you have no idea what's happening. My manager and two others went to investigate, thinking maybe a guest had gotten lost. They walked into the exact room where I'd been hearing the footsteps and found it empty. When they returned, we sat in our chairs until 8 p.m., listening. The sounds continued, wandering through the house. We tried to convince ourselves it was just creaking floors, but these were no ordinary creaks. They were distinct, deliberate footsteps, with the cadence of someone walking. I'll never know what was above us that day. Maybe there's a rational explanation, but let's just say I didn't sleep well for about a month afterward. When I was 6, I went to a restaurant with my dad and grandparents. As we walked in, I noticed a small room to the right filled with arcade machines. I can't remember if any other kids were there, but I was immediately captivated. At the table, I kept begging my dad to let me go play in the arcade. He pointed toward the gambling machines at the bar and said, "Those are for adults." I tried to explain I meant the arcade, but he wouldn't budge. After we finished eating and started leaving, I turned to point out the arcade once more, and it was gone. There was nothing there but a blank wall. When I was younger, I used to watch wrestling. One night, I was sitting alone in the living room, watching Friday Night SmackDown after my family had gone to bed. It was during the Undertaker vs. Shawn Michaels feud in 2009, so Shawn Michaels came out in all white, cutting a promo, and I was waiting for the Undertaker to appear. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming sense of fear, and a shiver ran down my spine. Then, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around and saw a shadowy, hooded figure pass behind me and vanish. I bolted from the living room into my bedroom, leaving the TV on. As a kid, I felt awful for wasting electricity, and even though I wanted to go back and turn it off, I was far too scared to move. I don't believe in the paranormal, so maybe it was just a hallucination, but it was still terrifying. My earliest memory is actually a dream. I was in a house, and my mom was teaching me how to read, cook, and all the basics of life. I woke up talking, full of excitement, around 2.5 years old. Before that, I was mostly mute, and my family couldn't believe it. In the dream, I kept asking myself questions. How do I know how to speak English? How do I know it's called English? How do I know this is my mom? How do I know the word for mom? 2 years later, we moved into that very house. I tugged on my mom's dress and told her, "This is the house from my dream." I'm in my 30s now, and she still remembers me describing the dream, including the entire layout of the house, which turned out to be 100% accurate. While we lived there, I had premonitions and terrible night terrors. At that age, I could barely navigate the stairs on my own or reach the light switches. Yet my mom would find me sleepwalking, crying in the pantry with every single light turned on, lights I couldn't physically reach awake. Somehow, I could move through the house at night in ways I couldn't during the day. My friend is part of a paranormal investigation group, and while she was giving a tour of a supposedly haunted theater, I hung back in the main theater to chat with a mutual friend. Suddenly, I heard a child's laugh, clear as day. None of the EMF detectors went off, but I swear it was sharper and more distinct than most human sounds I've ever heard. I could pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, but there was no one there, just the wall that the theater shared with a closed, empty store that used to be a morgue. The only other person on that floor was a man in his 50s, and the youngest person in the building was far too old to have made the sound. Local lore says a little girl from the 1950s or 60s haunts that room, because she enjoys being around people. Almost 20 years ago, when I was still living with my parents, I was asleep in bed with my cat curled up on my chest, her face close to mine. In the middle of the night, I woke and saw a ghostly figure of an old woman standing over my bed, staring straight at me. She had short hair, her arms hung straight by her sides, and I can only describe her coloring as something like a sepia photograph. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Then my cat hissed violently, dug her claws into my chest, and turned to look directly at the woman. That snapped me fully awake. Her fur was standing on end, and she continued hissing as I tried to calm her, my heart racing at the same time. I ended up burying my head under the sheets and stayed there for the rest of the night. I had been completely skeptical about the paranormal before that night, and I've never experienced anything like it since. But I know what I saw, and if it weren't for my cat reacting the way she did, I might have convinced myself it was just a dream. A little about my dad's house. I believe it was built in the late 70s, possibly became a deceased estate in the early 90s, then passed through one family before my dad bought it in '99. The old woman reminded me a bit of my grandmother, but I knew at the time that I didn't recognize her. I don't think it was anyone I knew. There was no personal connection. I live deep in the woods of Florida, 13 miles from the nearest gas station, 25 miles from the nearest town, and my only neighbors for 2 miles are my parents, who live across the street. It's just me, my 6-year-old son, and our dogs out here. In my living room, I have a giant gray sectional in an L shape. My son loves to pull up the ottoman, turning the couch into a massive bed, piling it with every blanket and pillow we own to make his camping nest. That night, he had passed out in it early, around 8 p.m. I got home from work a little early and decided to finally have some time to myself. I settled in with Skyrim and my medical cannabis, ready for a peaceful evening. About half an hour into the game, I heard Aries, my pit bull, bark. Just one insistent bark, the kind pets used to say, "Hey mom, I'm out here." I looked at the clock and muttered, "It's only 8:30. You're fine," and went back to my game. Every 15 minutes or so, I heard the same single bark. It wasn't aggressive, just urgent. And every time, I felt this irresistible urge to get up and let him in, but I ignored it. I was mid-dungeon quest and didn't want to lose my focus. Then it happened again. That bark. The one that made every mom understand, enough is enough. I threw down my controller in frustration, thinking, this dog is ridiculous, and as it hit the pile of blankets next to me, I heard a snore. A dog snore. My stomach dropped. I moved the blanket, and there was Aries, sound asleep, curled up next to my son. Dead asleep. My blood ran cold. The bark I'd been hearing? It hadn't come from the dog. Instant dread hit me like a physical weight. I can't describe it any other way than an ancient fear, old and primordial. A voice, clear in my head, whispered, "Don't move, baby. Don't get up. Just keep playing like you don't know anything is wrong, or it will notice. One step toward that door, and you're in trouble." I froze, clutching my controller, heart racing. The single bark echoed again a few times throughout the night, but by 11:45, the air finally felt normal. I didn't risk sleeping in my bedroom that night. I stayed on the couch with my son, too shaken to leave him alone. To clarify, yes, my parents have dogs, but theirs were inside for the night. My 2 other dogs didn't react at all, which made me realize this was something only I could hear. And Aries, my pit bull, was unmistakably asleep the whole time. It was my dog, but it wasn't my dog. When I was a teenager, I decided to skip school and go hiking alone in the Appalachian Mountains of south central Pennsylvania. The trail was small and secluded. You had to drive there, and there was no real foot traffic. I had the whole mountain to myself. I spent the hike singing and yelling just for fun, completely carefree, letting my voice carry across the peaks. On my way down from the summit, I suddenly heard my dad's voice call my name, urgent and insistent. "Come here. Help me." I froze. My first thought was that I must be losing my mind, or worse, having a stroke. I considered following the voice, trying to figure out why my dad would be there. But then reality hit me. He was in his office, over an hour away. The voice called again, clear and commanding, twice more in the span of a minute. Without a doubt, it was my father's voice. The urgency in it sent pure panic through me. I ran, faster than I ever had before, my bare feet pounding against the rocky trail as adrenaline took over. I never looked back, never went back to that trail. Once I reached my car, I drove straight to my dad's office. He was sitting at his desk, working, completely unaware of anything amiss. To this day, I still don't know what I heard that day. I come from a family of women who are unusually sensitive to the other side, and I grew up in a haunted house where the activity was centered almost entirely around my bedroom. I would often wake in the middle of the night to the sound of pages fluttering. Imagine dropping a bucket full of books from a great height, the chaotic sound echoing endlessly. I would always investigate, but the source was never there. The story I want to share, however, involves a house my boyfriend and I went to see while looking to buy. On paper, it was a dream home, but something about it felt deeply wrong. As we walked through each room, I couldn't shake the sense of a sinister presence, a heaviness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I finally told my boyfriend that we couldn't live there. I felt as though the air was thick with dark, unhappy spirits, each room carrying its own weight. It was like trudging through a dense forest in the dead of night, an oppressive force pressing down on me. My boyfriend, who doesn't believe in the paranormal, brushed it off, and we left. Later, still unsettled, I did some research on the property. What I found shocked both of us. The house had once been the town morgue. When it was sold, the builder had remodeled it entirely into a home before putting it on the market. The morgue had been the final stop for countless bodies, some of whom may have died violently. That revelation explained the sense of darkness I had felt so strongly. For the first time, my sensitivity to the paranormal was validated by cold, hard facts. Back in the 1980s, I went camping on Bluff Mountain, between the Blue Ridge Parkway and the Punch Bowl Shelter, part of the Appalachian Trail. You could camp just about anywhere off the dirt roads or trails, and we set up halfway up the mountain for a week. On the second to last day, we decided to do a day hike to the summit, taking our time to explore along the way. When we reached the top, we found the old fire tower foundations and, wandering a bit, stumbled across the Oddie Klein Powell Memorial. You can Google his name for the story. Remember, this was before the internet, so finding a memorial to a child who had died nearly 100 years before us was a profound experience. We spent some time reflecting and talking about it, then made our way back down to camp. That night, we slept outside our tents because the weather was perfect and it was our last night. The three of us laid in our sleeping bags lined up near the fire, a few feet apart. Around 3 a.m., as usual, we heard a distant train whistle, a sound that, strangely, made you aware of the time when camping in the backcountry. As I stirred, still half asleep, I heard something approaching. In the silence of the forest, every little sound stands out. I nudged my buddy to alert him. The noise grew louder and closer, heading straight for our camp. Suddenly, standing directly in front of us in the pitch-black night were two men holding shotguns, with a lantern between them. They wore overalls, boots, and hats. The guns were lowered but still aimed in our direction. I had the only weapon we brought, a CO2 pellet gun for keeping animals away, but it was useless against shotguns. Our hearts were pounding as we stared at each other, frozen in a standoff. One wrong move could have ended horribly. Without a word, they turned and walked off into the darkness. None of us spoke until their footsteps were far away. Shaken, we quickly packed up and hiked down the mountain before sunrise. Years later, I researched the story of Audie Klein Powell. Speaking with local historians and a professor writing a book about the Powell family, I learned something chilling. He suggested that what we encountered that night might not have been poachers or moonshiners at all, but the ghosts of the mountain. According to his research, search parties had combed those woods day and night for the missing boy back in 1887 to 88. Others had reported similar strange encounters over the years. The professor believes we came face to face with those restless spirits, still searching for Audie. At the time, I assumed it was just some terrified teenagers being checked out by locals. But knowing what I know now, I can't help but wonder if the mountain itself was alive with the past that night. So my friends and I were just hanging out by the river, having a few beers, when the sun started to set. We figured we should start heading back before it got too dark to see the trail. As we were walking, we saw something that looked kind of human. At first, we were worried. Maybe someone was hurt or needed help. We aimed our flashlight at it, but there was no face. I couldn't see it myself because my friend was closer, but he said it looked like static, like the visual noise on an old TV. Then it moved. In an instant, it went from lying down to standing upright and bolted. I've never seen anything move like that. It was huge, probably over 7 feet tall, and it ran in a way that was not human. Imagine something halfway between robotic and the way the Bionic Man ran. It moved faster and quieter than any person could. The hair on my arms stood straight up, like the electricity you feel in the air right before a thunderstorm, but the sky was clear, barely a cloud in sight. Every one of us was frozen, terrified, feeling a primal dread we'd never experienced before. We just stood there, silent, shaken, and then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness faster than we could process. To this day, none of us have ever felt fear like that. I was doing a workout on my Xbox 360, playing one of those Just Dance games. My son was still a baby, so I had him nearby while I stood in front of the TV, just texting for a moment. Suddenly, I heard this evil, sinister laugh coming straight from the TV. I looked up, and the screen said someone else had joined, but I was completely alone. In the silhouette viewer, the part that scans your body, it wasn't showing me. Instead, there was a swirling ball of light. Then things went haywire. The controls started moving on their own, like something unseen was pressing buttons. Heart racing, I immediately turned the console off, grabbed my baby, and ran outside. That wasn't the only time weird things have happened. There are so many more experiences I could tell. I grew up in a haunted house, and everyone who stayed the night seemed to have their own story. Usually, you'd catch quick flashes of white or black darting across a room or hallway if you turned your head too fast. I remember seeing a white cloud drift across my feet as I walked past an empty room. I'd be in bed and feel something poking me repeatedly, yet there was never anything visible in the room. A childhood friend once stayed over and swore she saw a black figure tiptoe across my kitchen at 2 a.m. The activity stopped after my dad passed away in that house. My mom said it shook something loose. She described a menacing figure standing over her bed in the middle of the night. After that, she had the house saged, blessed, and ritually cleansed. Since then, nothing unusual has happened. This isn't my story, it's my father's. He was living in Europe during the Gulf War and had bought a wardrobe, placing it parallel to his bed. In America, we usually bolt furniture to the wall, but my dad said that wasn't common in his part of Europe, so he didn't bother. One night, he suddenly heard his late grandfather's voice in his ear. "Chad, wake up now? Chad, please wake up. You have to leave." My dad had already lost much of his hearing during a previous injury and hadn't heard the fire alarm from a building next door that had caught fire. Because of that warning, he bolted upright just in time. The wardrobe toppled over, landing exactly where he had been sleeping. If he hadn't woken when he did, he could have died. Growing up, I lived in a house that was, well, it was something else. Things happened there that defy explanation, and I'll just list them, because it's easier than trying to tell it like a story. Footsteps on the stairs at night, when no one was upstairs. A massive painting, hanging at the far end of our 20-foot upstairs landing, somehow fell, landing in a crash right at my bedroom door on the opposite end of the landing. Every day at 3 p.m., all the heavy wrought iron and glass doorknobs and fixtures would unscrew themselves and thud to the floor, screws and everything, knocking in my walls that started behind my head and followed me as I moved around my room. My rosary, which hung on the side mirror of my antique 3-mirror vanity, would slowly tap up and down against the mirror, like someone invisible was lifting it to strike. Cabinets and drawers in the kitchen flying open on their own. Our schnauzer refusing to go upstairs, growling at the empty stairs. My younger sister's playroom, a room no one ever entered. Watching people climb the twisting staircase, they'd all speed up at the 7th step from the top, turn their heads, and practically run past the doorway on the left as soon as they reached it. The sound of a rocking chair moving in the attic room behind my closet. Someone, or something, walking down the hallway, through my door, across my room, and into my closet. My 80s stereo would turn on by itself, the manual dial swinging between channels. The same thing would happen with the TV. Coming home to knickknacks stacked in a perfect pyramid on the floor. Sometimes they had been carefully arranged on a tall shelving unit nearly to the ceiling. But the piece de resistance? My bed. Levitating. Full on, mid-air, with me and my cat in it, and later with my friends in it. The last time they stayed the night, the bed lifted violently, banging the right footboard against the floor like someone impossibly strong was pounding it up and down, bang. 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 My bed wasn't light. It was a massive wrought iron frame that took 2 people just to lift the headboard. And yes, I'm not making any of this up. I waited years to tell my mom, thinking my dad would try to find some rational explanation, which he, of course, did. Some of my family still doesn't know the full story. That house, it wasn't just haunted. It was alive in a way that made every day unpredictable and terrifying. When I was in high school, my friend and I were driving home from the movies. As we got close to my house, we both had this sudden, unnerving feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. It was one of those gut instincts you can't shake. Then, out of nowhere, this huge silver object appeared right in front of our windshield. My friend slammed on the brakes, heart racing. A red light shone from the object, scanning the inside of the car, like it was examining us. And just as suddenly as it appeared, it shot off into the night sky. We looked at each other, wide-eyed, and muttered in unison, "No one would ever believe this." And to this day, nobody does. We have no idea what it was, no logical explanation, no hint of anything that could account for it. It was just there. I must have been around 7 years old, living with my grandma, mom, and sister at the time. One night, everyone was hanging out in the basement, talking, when I realized I needed to use the bathroom. The only one was upstairs in the hallway. I was scared of being alone, so I decided to sprint through the house to get it over with. The layout is hard to explain, but basically you walked through the kitchen, then turned into a hallway with the living room on your left. The living room had 2 entrances, one from the hallway and one from the kitchen. As I passed the first entrance and approached the second, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a long, thin man lying on the floor. I stepped back, staring at the spot. He was gone. But before I could turn away, I looked up. There he was, an extremely tall young man, dressed in black, bending down and staring straight at my face, taking in every feature. I bolted downstairs and told my mom what I saw. Of course, she brushed it off as my imagination. Years later, I discovered who it was, my grandma's ex-husband, who had passed away a few weeks before I was born. Apparently, he had been looking at me. I also learned that I have the ability to see a few other things and receive messages from them, a gift I inherited from my mother. Recently, my grandma had her first encounter, but none of my siblings have ever experienced anything like it. Not sure if this counts as paranormal, but when my daughter was 2, she said something that completely freaked me out. One night, she was staring up at the moon, so I asked her what she was thinking. I was expecting something cute, like, "Is the moon made of cheese, Daddy?" Instead, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "We are all in the same cage." I'll admit, I panicked and basically ran away. How could a 2-year-old even come up with something like that? Years later, I heard the exact same line again. This time, it was Jack Nicholson in his very first line in Easy Rider, saying it to Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper in jail. And no, my daughter hadn't seen that movie at age 2. Not my story, but my uncle's. When my cousins were born, they bought them toys. One of them was like a Teddy Ruxpin, but it was a dog. One night, out of nowhere, it started going off on its own. Eventually, my uncle got fed up and pulled the batteries out. Not even a few minutes later, it started going off again, completely powerless. Needless to say, that thing was in the trash by the next day. Not exactly paranormal, but it's something I still think about. A few years ago, I was with a family member and one of their friends, and we decided to try a TikTok trend. The audio supposedly makes objects around you move while you cover your eyes. We didn't expect anything to happen, so we went to the quietest spot in a house party, the playroom, full of toys. We set up my phone pointing at a mirror desk, and all three of us got on our knees in front of the camera, letting the audio play. When it was over, we reviewed the footage and saw a plastic toy potato chip fly over us. We were weirded out, but not terrified. There was no possible explanation. None of us moved, no babies, no pets, nothing. Just the three of us, and that plastic potato chip. I still wonder how it happened, and why a potato chip. I lived in a house that was over 100 years old, and during the first month, strange things started happening almost immediately. One night, while my wife, then girlfriend, and I were asleep, a large decorative hookah flew across the room, launched about 8 feet. No one else was in the room. The cat, who had been sleeping on me, jumped up when it crashed. There was no explanation. Another day, my wife was in the kitchen doing dishes when I suddenly heard a woman's voice. It was unclear what it said, so I asked, "What was that, honey?" She replied, "I heard it too. The house had an open floor plan. No one else lived there, and it was just whispered between us." One night, I was up on the computer, not even that late, when all the kitchen cabinets suddenly began slamming in a strange, deliberate pattern. I finally spoke out, asking whatever it was to stop, telling it we just wanted to live together in peace. After a pause, one large cabinet slowly opened and started slamming again, but just before it could crash, it gently closed. There were other smaller incidents in that first month, but after the cabinet episode, nothing major happened, until we were moving out 2 years later. By then, we were married, had a baby, and had purchased a new house. The early activity felt like a distant memory. During the move, strange things started again. Lights would turn off on me, and while I was leaning into a closet to grab something, it felt like I was pushed in. The sliding closet door slammed shut, and my phone wouldn't even turn on. My brother came over to help move one last heavy item. The house was empty, and as we were leaving, he looked back and noticed a baby toy in the middle of the floor, something I didn't recognize. I swear it hadn't been there seconds before. He reached to grab it, and I said, "No, don't touch it." He looked at me, then said, "Good call." We left and never went back. Writing this down now, 10 years later, it still feels surreal. Ooh, I've got a creepy one. It's not exactly an act, but it still freaked me out. When I was younger, my dad and brothers watched some horror movie. I don't remember the name, but I hate horror films, so I didn't watch. After the movie, my brothers went to sleep in their room, sharing a bunk bed. My dad slept in my room because I had a pull-out bed underneath mine. I was really young, so it wasn't unusual. A few hours into the night, one of my brothers came running into my room, sweating and distressed. He said that both he and my other brother felt really unsafe in their room and were having terrible nightmares. So my dad and I swapped rooms with them and tried to sleep. Here's where it gets weird. As soon as we were in their room, my dad and I started having nightmares too. We were sweating, waking up constantly, despite the fact that I never even watched the movie. Eventually, we managed to sleep through the night. The next morning at breakfast, I started describing the nightmare I had, and both my dad and my brothers just stared at me, wide-eyed. Then they said they had the exact same nightmare. Every single detail. I've never messed with horror films since. That experience was just too real. To preface this, I'm as skeptical now as I was then, but this is the only experience I've ever had that felt remotely paranormal, and to this day, I have no explanation for it. A few years ago, my sister and I were visiting our childhood home for the summer, sharing the same bedroom. One night, we woke to a heavy, jostling noise at our door. It didn't take long to realize what it was. Someone, or something, was twisting the doorknob violently, trying to get in. We exchanged wide-eyed glances, suddenly fully awake. The knob kept turning, forceful and relentless. No voices, no whispers, just the sound of the knob being manhandled over and over. "Is that Dad?" I asked. My sister had already woken up and looked just as uneasy. If it were him, she would have opened the door by now, but she hadn't. Our grandma was in the next room, our two aunts across the hall. None of them sleepwalked. None of them had a habit of wandering in the middle of the night. "I don't know," my sister whispered. We were teenagers, primed for imagination, but even in that half-asleep haze, we knew this was different. Whoever, or whatever, it wasn't anyone familiar. My dad worked nights and always told us when he'd be home. There was no reason for him to be at our door at 2 in the morning, never mind doing it silently, just turning the knob. "Dad," I called, panic creeping in. No answer. Only the knob continued twisting. Eventually, I opened the door and peered into the pitch-black hallway. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The knob was quiet, the hallway empty, my dad's room untouched. No footsteps, no door opening. I told my sister, "I don't think it's Dad." We went back to bed, hoping it was over. But almost immediately, the knob started shaking again. Frantic, insistent, wordless. We locked the door, just like my dad had instructed, but it didn't matter. The urgency, the violence, the repetition, it was impossible to ignore. For hours, we lay there, terrified. The doorknob's frenzy would surge, then pause, teasing us with the false hope that it had stopped, only to start again. I remember sweating, imagining what we'd do if the door finally gave way. The fear, the confusion, the helplessness, it was all-consuming. Eventually, the noise subsided, and we drifted back to sleep. The next morning, we asked our dad if he had been at the door. He said he had come home that night, but had not knocked on our door or even checked on us. Nothing was amiss. No break-ins, no unlocked doors, no explanation. To this day, my sister and I still can't explain it. No thief, no prank, no logical reason. Something unexplainable was at our door that night, twisting the knob with urgent intent. And I'll never forget it. I used to work at a restaurant with a dark history. A patron had supposedly choked to death in the back dining room. Over the years, multiple staff reported strange occurrences. Phone cords swinging when no one was around, the sound of coughing or footsteps, and candles in the back dining room mysteriously relighting between the nightly blowout and the final walkthrough. I started out as a dishwasher, and almost immediately, I noticed something strange. I would constantly hear whistling in my ear, though no one was there. One day, we were joking about the ghost when something happened that really shook me. I was standing in the wait station, talking to Becky, one of the waitresses, holding an empty dish rack in front of me. Right in front of us was the swinging kitchen door, a heavy, old wooden door with its original hinges. It had a diamond-shaped window to prevent collisions, and to keep it open, you had to push and wiggle it just right. As I turned to go through, the door swung inward toward the kitchen and stayed perfectly open. No one was visible through the window. Becky and I just froze, staring at each other, then back at the door, our eyes wide. The only other person in the restaurant was Mike, the cook. I called out, "Mike, where are you?" "In the window," he replied. "Why?" "Did you open the door?" I asked. "What are you talking about?" I explained what had happened. Mike walked over from the window, maybe 5 feet away, and looked at the door. He'd been at the window, cutting vegetables the entire time. No explanation ever came, and it never happened again. I was glad someone else had witnessed it. Interestingly, all the ghostly activity seemed to stop after they remodeled and absorbed the back dining room into the expanded kitchen. I live in a haunted house. Here are some of the things that happen here. We often hear conversations, soft, whispery voices. You can hear the tones and cadence of speech, but never the words themselves. We've gone room to room, checked outside, even made sure nothing on the radio or TV was playing. There's never been an explanation. One evening, I went to make sure the front door was locked. My husband said, "Don't lock that. Our daughter is outside." I replied, "No, she isn't. I went to check. She was in her bedroom, and she hadn't left for quite some time." She insists she never went outside. My husband, though, swore he saw her leave. Another time, I got up in the morning and saw our daughter sitting at the small kitchen table, drinking coffee. I wondered why she was home so late, since she works an early shift. Turns out, she had been gone for more than an hour when I saw her. My husband once lost a permanent marker. We looked everywhere. A few days later, he was telling a visiting neighbor how badly he needed it. They were sitting at the small kitchen table when the marker literally fell out of thin air onto the floor. My husband was stunned, and the neighbor left, thoroughly creeped out. We think one of the spirits might be a child who likes to play. My husband would go to bed, and something would tug on his big toe. After a few nights, I told him to firmly ask it to stop, explaining he had to get up early and needed sleep. The tugging stopped for months. Then we decided to prank him. Our grandson crawled into the bedroom not long after my husband and I had gone to bed. He managed to sneak up 3 times before my husband finally caught him. Everyone laughed. The boy returned to the living area with his mom and sister. A few minutes later, my husband felt another tug on his toes. He yelled for our grandson. From across the house, the boy answered, "What?" It wasn't him. There are so many more stories I could tell. We've lived here for years, and these are just the ones that come to mind. I've experienced this kind of thing a lot as a kid, and only once as an adult. Even thinking about some of it gives me chills, so I'll skip the truly terrifying moments. I really don't want to relive those. But one memory from my childhood sticks with me. My sister and I were living in this house, and we constantly heard someone calling our names. One night, I woke up to my sister screaming. The light in the room was glowing green. When I looked, I saw a child watching her, and I literally froze. My sister ran to turn on the lights, and the figure was gone. I still don't believe in ghosts, and I try my hardest to forget the horrible things I've seen. I want to think logically, even though some of what I've witnessed has no explanation. But I feel a deep sympathy for anyone labeled crazy for seeing things they can't explain. I know exactly how that feels. When I was younger, around 4 to 7, I used to hide under my bed sheets, pretending it was a cave. One day, while I was hiding, I heard a voice say, "Hello." From the corner of my eye, I saw two glowing red eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth. I screamed. My sister, who shared the room with me, woke up, but she found nothing. Another time in that same house, I woke in the middle of the night and saw tiny, shadowy figures running across the floor. They looked like three-dimensional shadows. I know it wasn't a dream because I made my sister take me to our parents' room, and I slept there that night. I saw them again once when my sister was away at camp. My dad had gotten up around 2 a.m. to get ready for work and was in the kitchen, so I stayed in the lounge. This time, I saw wisp-like shapes floating from the floor. I even touched one, and it reacted to me. I know it was real. The final experience was hearing my dad say, "Good morning," when he wasn't even home. Ever since we moved out of that house, I haven't seen anything paranormal, except sleep paralysis, but that doesn't count. In Ottawa, Ontario, there's a hostel that used to be a jail, the site of Canada's last execution. Naturally, legends say it's haunted. My wife and I stayed there on Halloween 2019. The rooms are tiny former jail cells, and bathrooms are communal. It's creepy, but also kind of thrilling. During our stay, I experienced two things I can only describe as paranormal. First, several times in the night, I woke to the sound of clanking, like a guard walking past and dragging a baton along the cell bars. Small, but unsettling, especially in the silence of the old jail. The second incident was even stranger. I had set a timer on my phone to wake me up. After it went off, I decided I wanted an extra 30 minutes of sleep. I set the timer again and placed the phone back on the ledge. When I woke, the phone had somehow fallen onto me. The ledge was narrow, and the charger was plugged in and out of reach. I checked the timer. Less than 30 seconds had passed. It felt as though something didn't want me to hear that alarm again. I work at an ancient pub out in the middle of nowhere in the UK. In the summer, it gets packed, and as head chef, it wasn't unusual for me to be alone in the kitchen until 2 or 3 a.m. Plenty of staff had their ghost stories, but I never paid much attention. They all sounded a bit dramatic, like extras in a low-budget horror film. One night, around 3 a.m., I was the only person left. I was finishing up and mopping. I always do it in 2 stages, a wet mop to lift the dirt, then a dry mop to finish it off. I'd done the wet run, and the floor was soaking. To reach every corner, I had to back out through one of the kitchen doors onto the pub floor. I stepped outside for a cigarette, letting the hot water and cleaning chemicals do their work. Halfway through, I heard the sound of a kitchen door closing. I looked around, but from where I was standing, I could see all the entrances and exits. I would have seen anyone moving through. I shrugged it off, assuming I'd imagined it. I finished my cigarette and went back inside to start the dry mop. Again, I had to back out through one of the doors. That's when I looked down and saw wet footprints on the wooden floor. Some were mine, but the others were barefoot, and they definitely weren't mine. I didn't stick around to investigate. I got out of there as fast as I could and drove home like a man possessed. The next day, I checked the CCTV. No one had moved at all. I was about to go to bed at my grandparents' place, alone on the gallery. The moonlight was pale and eerie, and a thick fog was rolling across the fields. I must have been around 10 to 14 years old. I gazed up at the stars, and then I saw it. One star, moving in a way no star should. It bounced from one star to another, up, down, back and forth, almost like it was dancing across the sky. I rubbed my eyes, sure I was imagining it. I looked away for a moment, then back, and there it was, still dancing. I couldn't believe it. This happened back around 2009 to 2010. I was working as an ER nurse at Mills Peninsula in Millbrae during the swine flu outbreak. The ER was absolutely slammed with patients, and I got pulled for the first time to the fast-track ER at Mills Health Center, which we were running like an urgent care for rapid flu tests. I was working with a very cranky veteran nurse. Let's call her Esther. She didn't like anyone, but I didn't have time to worry about that. It was chaos. The fast-track ER was set up in a U-shape. Reception was at the bottom of the U, the nursing station behind that, and 2 hallways of patient rooms lined the sides. Inside the U, there was a makeshift lab connecting both sides, and 2 big supply rooms that had once been inpatient surgery rooms. Those rooms had call lights at 4 bed spaces, but the old analog system was disconnected. The new digital system was tied to the computer and our badge sensors. That night, we were using one of those big supply rooms as a holding area for 4 patients waiting for rapid flu tests. Curtains divided the beds. When a bed was ready for a new patient, we'd pull the curtain back. If it was drawn, it meant a patient was there. The shift was nonstop, but around 2 a.m., things slowed down. We decided to stop using the 4 bedrooms, so all beds were empty, curtains pulled back, and lights off. As I went to grab a blanket for a patient in the hallway, I noticed the curtain around the 4th bed had been pulled closed. I went up front to check with Esther. "We aren't using those beds anymore," she confirmed. "Then why is someone putting a patient in there?" I asked. I went back and pulled the curtain open. No patient. I tucked the curtain back. 15 minutes later, the curtain was drawn around the bed again, but there was still no one there. Around 4 a.m., it was just me, Esther, and the receptionist. We were doing shift checkoffs, and as we passed the 4-bedroom, the curtain had closed around that 4th bed again. I was sure someone was messing with me. I pulled it open, thinking I'd call Esther out. She looked at me calmly. "Oh, you haven't heard? There's a ghost in that room," she said matter-of-factly. Apparently, years ago a drunk man had been brought in, placed in that 4th bed, and forgotten. He choked on his vomit and died. According to Esther, his spirit lingered. Almost on cue, the call light for that bed, disconnected for years, chimed. The light on the console came on. Esther just raised an eyebrow. I had to go back to turn it off. When I returned, the curtain was drawn around the bed again, exactly as before. At that moment, I realized it wasn't a joke. I spoke aloud. "Look, I'm sorry that happened to you, okay? I promise I won't leave anyone here without checking on them." It felt like he just wanted to be acknowledged, to make sure someone did their rounds. Esther asked, "You're not scared?" "No," I said. "What's there to be scared of? A ghost that pulls curtains and flips call lights." She nodded. "Good. I'll tell them you can come back here and work with me." From that night on, I never saw anything more dramatic, just the occasional curtain pulling, call bell lighting, and a few small shenanigans. But whenever I was assigned to Mills, I'd check in. If you remembered him, he didn't need attention. If you didn't, well, prepare for a ghostly reminder to keep you on your toes. When I was a kid, my friends and I were obsessed with scary stories. Bloody Mary, summoning ghosts, all of it. One day, on a dare, we started speaking in gibberish and jokingly promising our souls to the devil if it would let us see a ghost. That night, I went to the garage to grab something, and I swear I saw a blue orb floating in the middle of the room. The air felt icy, like a sudden chill had swept through. I flipped the lights on as fast as I could and refused to step back inside. I tried telling my parents, but they didn't believe in ghosts. Since then, I've been terrified of being alone in the dark in my own house, though for a while, I became obsessed with horror stories and creepypasta to feed the fear. My house in England was built just after the war. The 3 houses around us have all had residents pass away, and ours always feels off. There's a constant chill in the air and strange noises you can't explain. I have a baby toy stored in the loft that will start singing randomly early in the morning. There's no way I'm going up there to stop it. Something even stranger. Our neighbor's cat was deliberately hit by a car across the road. I've seen a black cat running through my house, and I know it's her. The accident left her tail cut off. I told the neighbors, and they said they'd seen her dart through their house too. I chased her into the outhouse, and she simply vanished. Things in the house go missing or move on their own. Just the other night, a framed photo flew off the wall, knocking down 2 family pictures below it. I call the spirit in this house Neagle. I've got a couple of experiences. When I was 5, my mom and I had just moved into a new house. It was just the 2 of us. She worked a lot, so I was mostly raised by my grandparents. No dad, no one else living with us. One night, I was lying in bed late. Nickelodeon had switched to George Lopez, and from my door, I could see the whole living room. Suddenly, a huge shadow rolled into the room, human-shaped, about my mom's height. I quietly yelled for my mom, and the shadow's head turned toward me. Its eyes were glowing green. I hid under the covers for what felt like 5 minutes, and when I peeked out, it was gone. I ran to my mom's room. She was out cold. Ever since then, I see this figure every time we move. Sometimes it's wandering around during the day or sitting at my dining table, lounging on the couch, even in the backyard. It's never seemed hostile, just lost. I don't mind it much anymore, though it still scares the hell out of me sometimes. Here's another one, a little less paranormal, but still weird. I read tarot, and I was giving my friend Jack a love reading. She had been on and off with a guy for years. The reading basically warned of infidelity and that she was about to go through a big change because of it. She jokingly called her boyfriend and brushed it off. A week later, she called me sobbing. He had been cheating. This happened during a trip to Japan. Halfway through, my friend, boyfriend, and I were staying at an Airbnb in Osaka. It was late at night when we quietly entered the building's lobby with our luggage. Above the elevator doors, a mostly black television screen caught my eye, a faint light glowing in one corner. When we pressed the up button, the screen flickered on, revealing an empty elevator. The faint light turned out to be the floor indicator. The whole thing gave me chills, but I didn't tell anyone at the time. We made it to the 5th floor studio apartment. My boyfriend and friend decided to head out for drinks from a nearby vending machine, while I stayed behind to unpack. Not long after, I heard frantic knocking at the door. They explained that the elevator had been acting strangely on the way down. It stopped at the 4th floor, doors opened, then closed. Stopped at the 3rd floor, doors opened, then closed. Stopped at the 2nd floor, Doors opened, then closed. By the time it reached the first floor, the doors opened, and nobody was there. They exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to be afraid or ready to defend themselves from whatever might be manipulating the elevator. Back in the apartment, we tried to relax and unpack, but the doorbell rang. In a synchronized panic, I held a finger to my lips, signaling the guys to check, while I tiptoed to turn off a nearby light. They cautiously approached the door and checked the peephole. Nobody was there. Sleep that night was impossible. The following evening, our friend went out drinking, leaving just me and my boyfriend in the apartment. He had fallen asleep while I was hanging up laundry when the doorbell rang again. Forgetting the previous night, I assumed it was our friend. I peeked through the peephole, empty hallway. Panicking quietly, I woke my boyfriend and gestured wildly. He checked, even stepped into the hallway, still nobody. On our last night, as we packed for our trip back to Tokyo, I sat in a daze at a table littered with clothes and souvenirs. I noticed something glowing inside a plastic bag. I assumed it was my phone and reached in, only to find a Gasapon toy light, still inside its taped-up capsule. The toy kept flashing in my hand. We all stared at it in disbelief until my friend grabbed it, and the light immediately went out. The guys shook, inspected, and fiddled with it, but nothing worked. After returning home, I finally opened the capsule and discovered the toy needed a carefully placed sticker removed, a tab pulled out, and a switch turned on to activate it. Even knowing the explanation now, I can't shake how genuinely eerie it felt at the time, flashing mysteriously in a sealed capsule during those tense, empty nights. I grew up in a small town where a minor Civil War battle had taken place. My best friend lived in the historical district filled with pre-Civil War homes. I was thrilled when I got to stay at his house because they had this small brick building in the backyard. Just one window, all brick, but it had been renovated into a tiny living space with carpet, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a full-size bed that folded down from the wall. As an 11-year-old with a Nintendo 64, snacks, and TV at my disposal, I was beyond excited. We even painted a little sign for the window, River Boys 64 Hideout, pure imagination at work. The first night went perfectly. We crushed Code Red Mountain Dew, ate snacks, and played Mario Kart, Mario Party, and 007 for hours. The TV was as loud as we wanted, the AC as cold as we wanted. Finally, we turned everything off and climbed into the full-size bed together. Not long after lying down, we started hearing chains rattling. Not faint, not deafening, just rattling. Then came a low hum, like a dozen people quietly singing a hymn. I have no idea how long it lasted, but it felt like forever. We lay there, frozen, not saying a word. When it ended, we whispered about how we needed to get out. We flung the door open and bolted back to his parents' house, sleeping on the floor that night. His parents heard nothing and had no explanation. After a few days, we eventually pushed the memory aside. Fast forward to senior year, 2004, 7 years later. We had a history assignment on the town's Civil War era. My friend chose the historical district. Another student was researching slave owners and their properties. As she presented her PowerPoint, she showed pictures of old slave quarters. Then I saw it. The shed my friend had converted into our River Boys 64 hideout was, in fact, an old slave quarter. And in the window was our sign, exactly as we had left it all those years ago. I swear my jaw hit the floor. My face went pale, and a chill ran down my spine. That memory is burned into my mind, an innocent childhood hangout turning into a living reminder of history in the eeriest way possible. This is a story my dad told me about his childhood. When he was around 15, one night around 11 p.m., he was cycling home from his aunt's house. On his route, he had to pass by a graveyard. Suddenly, a screw fell out of his bicycle tire. Without it, he couldn't safely ride home. The nearest mechanic was too far away, so he started searching the road in the dark, but couldn't find it. Just as he was about to give up and walk home with his bike, he noticed a tall man standing nearby. The man asked if he needed help. My dad explained the situation, and the man calmly walked a few meters, picked up a screw from the ground, and, with his bare hands, placed it back in the bike and tightened it perfectly. My dad thanked him and went home, planning to take the bike to a mechanic in the morning to properly tighten the screw. The next day, he explained the situation to the mechanic, who tried to tighten the screw, but couldn't. The mechanic told him it was already completely tight. Since it would have been impossible for a normal person to do that by hand, and because my dad never saw the man's face, he has always believed he encountered a ghost that night. Over the course of a year, I kept noticing random tapping on my metal bed frame. Even stranger, my room would sometimes become pitch black, so dark that I couldn't see my hand in front of me. Eventually, I called in a woman who performs exorcisms. She told me it was a malevolent spirit trying to make me feel comfortable so it could possess me. After performing her rituals, the tapping stopped, the darkness never returned, and for the first time in a long while, I finally got a good night's sleep. Not a scary story exactly, but it still gets to me, and I'm not usually into any of this stuff. When I turned 6, I was gifted a cat, and she was the sweetest companion. She passed away at a good age, but even more than 15 years later, I still distinctly hear her scratching her nails on the carpet. Sometimes I wake up feeling the familiar weight of her curled around my head. I don't really believe in ghosts or the afterlife, but damn, sometimes it really feels like she's still here. For months, when I was around 8 or 9, I kept seeing dark, hooded figures in my room late at night. They seemed to emerge from the darkest corners of the walls and floated straight toward my bed instead of walking. They communicated with me telepathically, telling me not to be afraid and that everything was okay, but I was still terrified. One of them would often place a hand on my head, as if trying to comfort me. Their skin looked like shadow, and their eyes glowed red. After a few months, I never saw them again. As an adult, I've experienced sleep paralysis, and I sometimes wonder if that's what it had been. Hi, I'm Japanese. One day, my sister and I were at home when we heard a loud tapping on the back window. My sister got really scared, so I went to check, but nothing was there. We went back to watch TV, and soon the tapping started again. By now, both of us were terrified. I thought maybe it was a prank from a friend, but minutes later the tapping returned, tap, 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 over and over. Eventually, it stopped, and we were relieved. We continued watching TV until our grandma, Tomoko, came in with some items from the shop. We told her what had happened, and she suddenly became very scared. She told us to cover all the windows with paper and not to look outside. I asked her why, but she told me not to worry. That night, she put 4 rice bowls in the corners of the room, covered the living room windows with paper, and told me not to leave my room until the next day at noon, not for anyone, not even her. Later, my grandpa came home from work. When my grandma explained the situation, he was visibly shaken and worried. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear tapping on the window throughout the night. I was terrified. I'm 21 now, and nothing has happened since that tap, tap, tap incident. Has anyone else in Japan ever experienced something like this? This happened recently. My boyfriend and I were watching a comedy movie in bed together. Luckily a comedy, because if it had been a horror film, I don't think I'd be staying over anymore. The bed is tucked into a corner of the room, and next to it, my boyfriend has these pull-up racks mounted on the wall. We mostly use them to dry clothes or towels. That evening, a towel was hanging there, along with a pair of jeans. There was a gap between the two items, which is important for what happened next. As we lay in bed, we both noticed movement out of the corner of our eyes. The towel started swinging from left to right, not like a gentle sway from a draft, but the whole towel moving on its own, as if something had passed through it. The jeans, however, remained perfectly still. Windows and doors were closed, so nothing could have caused it. We just stared, frozen, as the towel swung for what felt like an eternity. Needless to say, we were pretty shaken, and I had a hard time sleeping that night. This is more creepy than paranormal, but it still haunted me as a kid. I must have been around 6 years old, and I had a big Grover doll in my bedroom, propped up on a table. One day, for some reason, I felt like it was staring at me. I stared back, and before I knew it, I was frozen, locked in place, completely unable to pull myself away from this staring contest. Then, without warning, it fell over. I screamed and bolted out of the room. That doll had probably been sitting there for days, but for some reason, it chose that exact moment to topple. During high school, we had a retreat where we had to spend the night in an old house owned by the original landowner of the school, a sort of tradition. It was a massive villa with a long history. The wealthy owner had passed away, not in the home, and his widow donated it to a cloister of nuns. They converted it into a TB hospital before eventually turning it into a school. Records of deaths or burials on the property were non-existent, pre-medical record days. Staff had always mentioned strange occurrences, cold spots, whispers, and one woman even reported seeing a little girl reflected in a bathroom mirror. She turned away for a second, only to hear something shatter. When she looked back, the mirror was cracked. Naturally, with 40-plus teenage girls crammed into the house, half nervous, half eager to play Ghostbusters, sleep was impossible. My friends and I were trying to quiet everyone down when a sudden slam echoed from the hallway leading to the bathroom. The room turned icy, and a low, almost growling sound filled the air. My hair stood on end. The only thing keeping anyone from bolting out of the room was the chaperone's warning. Any student caught out of bed would be suspended. Exhaustion eventually forced everyone into uneasy sleep. The next morning, the chaperone scolded us furiously for running up and down the hallways all night. The problem? Nobody had left their sleeping bags. Years later, a friend who became a chaperone returned to the house and admitted they tried asking the ghost a few questions. Apparently, something was still there. And I can't help but think that our presence that night may have invited more than one spirit in. This happened sometime during the 2020 quarantine, one of the few times I was home alone. My dog and I were in the basement because that's where my Xbox was set up. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a full trash bag being rifled through. Assuming it was my dog, I ran upstairs to stop him, but then I remembered he was still with me in the basement. The noise was definitely coming from upstairs. Feeling uneasy, I decided to take my dog for a walk. Honestly, I'm glad I don't live in that house anymore. There are plenty of stories about that place, and this is just one of the creepier ones. This is an experience my nan and granddad had. My dad was born extremely premature, around 6 months, and weighed only about 2 pounds in 1968. Due to his fragile condition, my grandparents were told to manage their expectations as he faced many serious health complications. One night, they were in bed, keeping a watchful eye on their baby who slept in a cot beside them. Suddenly, they both sat up and saw my great-granddad, who had passed years earlier, walk right through the wall and stand over the cot. They both witnessed it clearly. My granddad, terrified, said out loud, "Please don't take him. He isn't ready to go." My great-granddad simply turned and walked back through the wall, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. Not long after, a priest was called to the house, and even up until about 15 years ago, there was still holy water placed in several rooms of my grandparents' home. About 15 years ago, I had an encounter I'll never forget. It was around 2 or 3 a.m., and I came out of my room to head downstairs to the bathroom. At the far end of the hall, a bright night light glowed to the left of a room, spilling light from the stairwell into the space before it. There, in the middle of the hallway, I saw a massive black shape. It was roughly the size of a Rottweiler, lying in the darkness but outlined by the light. My heart froze, my mind screaming, "What the hell is that?" I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, then somehow forced my legs to move. I sprinted the 4 or so feet to the light switch. Just before my hand hit it, I caught a flicker, what looked like a red eye. And the instant the lights came on, it was gone. I've never seen anything like it since. My cousin has a wild story, probably the only ghost story I've ever believed because he's not the type to exaggerate. He was working over Christmas break with his university supervisor in an old section of dorms that had been converted into storage and miscellaneous rooms. They were replacing long fluorescent lights, one by one. Ladder up, cousin hands the supervisor the new light, swap it in, toss the old one. Simple, routine work. He was chatting with his supervisor when suddenly the supervisor went silent, staring down the corridor. My cousin turned to see why and froze. About 10 feet down the hall, a bright orb hovered in midair, glowing like a floating light bulb. It lingered long enough for the two of them to exchange glances, then stare at it in silence. The temperature had dropped drastically. The hallway, warm just moments ago, now felt ice cold. The supervisor asked if my cousin was seeing the same thing or losing his mind. My cousin confirmed he saw it too. Then, the orb drifted to the right and passed straight through a closed door. They sprinted to the door, threw it open, and found just a room full of boxes. No sign of the orb. They packed up their tools as fast as possible and left for the day. It's not the most elaborate ghost story, but hearing him tell it, dead serious, really sticks with me. I'm not normally one to believe in ghosts, but that story always gets to me. An experience happened to my sister and me, and we were the only ones who could see it, a black shadow wolf. We had gotten into a fight one night, and my sister ended up sleeping in the living room. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night and noticed something on the wall. It looked about the size of a cat, with a long tail and what appeared to be a wing. My first rational thought was that it must be our cat. I yelled at my sister to get her cat off the wall, only to realize she wasn't there, and our cat was locked in the bathroom. Plus, it didn't have wings. Terrified, I closed my eyes, hoping it would disappear. It didn't. Instead, it moved further up the wall. Eventually, I convinced myself I must be imagining things and rolled over to try to fall back asleep. Little did I know, that same night my sister had her own visitor. She heard noises in the kitchen, scraping nails across the floor like a dog walking. But we didn't have any dogs. It moved toward the living room, and she squeezed her eyes shut. The sound stopped right in front of her. She felt it breathing on her face, and then it was gone. We assumed we saw two different creatures that night. Afterward, the shadow wolf followed us home, though no one else could see it. We had come back from Blackwell, Missouri, a place notorious for paranormal activity. Our parents were trying to scare us with ghost stories about haunted headlights and witches throwing babies into wells. The shadow wolf followed our car all the way home. It lingered for a while, often appearing in my sister's dreams and even allowing her to dreamwalk. She once said she entered our dad's dream, and when we asked him about it, he confirmed he had dreamt of her with a black dog. One day, it simply stopped appearing and we never saw it again. We were never afraid of it, and it never harmed us. I've only shared this story with a few people because it sounds so unbelievable. I call it a shadow dog because, while it had form, its fur was wispy like smoke, constantly shifting. At times it was almost invisible, at others, it was as clear as day. I must have been 10 or 11, and my sister 12 or 13 at the time. I have a cup story too, one I've shared a few times in creepy askreddit threads over the years. This happened back in 1998. I was 14. My dad had passed away the previous summer. I was in the basement watching TV while my mom sat in the living room on the ground floor, also watching TV. She had a habit of stomping on the floor to get my attention instead of yelling down the stairs. That day, she stomped much more violently than usual, practically screaming my name. I ran up the stairs, through the kitchen and dining room, into the living room. There she was, seated in a chair in front of the TV, with a solid wood TV table perfectly flat on the floor in front of her. On the table sat a single styrofoam cup, empty. And the cup was shaking. Not a little. It was spinning, rocking, lifting slightly off the table, almost like it was doing the hokey pokey. My mom said she had just finished her drink and set the cup down, and that's when it started. The windows were closed, no fans on, and the table was completely stable. I checked for strings, wires, anything that could be making it move. Nothing. I even picked it up and put it back. It started shaking again. Her feet weren't touching it, and the table itself didn't move. Mom whispered, maybe it was Dad. I told him to stop because it was scaring me, and just like that, the cup froze mid-motion. Not a twitch, not a shake. Completely still. I watched it for a while, but it didn't move again. I still don't know what caused it. I've talked about it with my mom, thought about it for years, and there's no reasonable explanation. It's one of those moments I can't debunk, no matter how hard I try. There's one night I'll never forget. My mom begged me not to go out. She had a horrible feeling and pleaded with me to stay home. Being a teenager, I ignored her, thinking she was just overreacting. That night, a fight broke out where 3 of my friends were shot, not fatally, but it was terrifying. Luckily, I wasn't there and got out safely. Another time, back in elementary school, I fell on the playground and seriously injured my leg. My mom was already halfway to the school when they called, so she missed the call. By the time she arrived, the school staff assumed she had gotten the message and praised her for showing up so quickly, though in reality, she had been guided there by instinct. The worst memory, though, came after the shooting incident. One night, she again told me, "Please, don't go out tonight." This time, I listened. The friend I would have been driving with got into a car crash and died. Another passenger survived, so maybe I would have too, but it's chilling to think about. Even now, when I'm having a bad day or feeling off, my mom will call and simply say, "What's wrong?" I can just feel something isn't right. I've been to the Winchester Mystery House twice, once for the regular tour and once for the Halloween haunted house event. The Halloween experience was by far the best I've ever seen, with endless eerie scenarios that kept going and going. I'll remember it forever. During the regular tour, something strange happened. I saw a thick mist slowly roll down a mirror on an upstairs cabinet. I'm certain it wasn't a trick of the eye or caused by any outside influence. I wanted to point it out to my then wife and the rest of our group, but all I got was a glare and a reminder to hurry along. I let it go, though I've never forgotten it.